The car dealership's showroom was bustling with energy that Saturday afternoon. Gleaming new cars sparkled under the fluorescent lights, each polished to perfection, waiting for the next eager buyer. The faint scent of leather and polish filled the air, mingling with the hum of muffled conversations and laughter. Angela strode into the dealership with confidence, her heels clicking against the polished tile floor. She was dressed to impress, wearing a fitted dress and a pair of designer sunglasses perched atop her head. Today, she wasn't just here to browse, she was ready to make a big purchase. She'd saved up enough for a down payment on the sleek convertible she had been eyeing online, and she was determined to leave the dealership in it. Angela felt the stares as she entered, though she had grown accustomed to it. She was used to people underestimating her, but she knew how to command respect. She walked directly toward the convertible, inspecting the luxurious interior, already imagining herself cruising down the highway with the wind in her hair. However, as she ran her fingers over the leather seats, a man approached. He was tall, with salt and pepper hair, wearing a crisp, dark suit and a smug expression that seemed permanently etched on his face. His name tag read Gary. Angela noticed his eyes flick over her once, pausing a second too long before he spoke. "Can I help you with something, ma'am?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. Angela smiled politely, ignoring the tone. "Yes, I'd like to test drive this convertible. I've been looking at it for a while now, and today's the day." Gary's eyes narrowed slightly. "Are you sure that's the car you want to test? It's a bit on the pricey side. You might want to consider something more affordable." Angela's smile faltered slightly, but she kept her cool. She had dealt with men like Gary before, and she wasn't going to let him ruin her excitement. "Thank you, but I'm sure this is the one I want." Gary chuckled, a mocking edge to his laughter that made her skin prickle. "All right, if you say so. But, you know, these kinds of cars aren't just for anyone. They require a certain level of financial stability." Angela's eyes flashed, her temper barely contained. She felt the weight of his judgment and knew exactly what he was implying. "I can afford it," she said, her voice calm but firm. Gary crossed his arms, his smirk widening. "Really? So, are you paying in cash, or are you just looking for a quote today?" Angela clenched her fists, struggling to keep her composure. "I'll be putting down a significant deposit and financing the rest," she replied, her voice steely. "Now, if you could get the keys, I'd like to take it for a test drive." Gary's smile disappeared, replaced by a look of irritation. "We don't usually give test drives to customers who aren't pre-approved. It's a policy we have." Angela raised an eyebrow. "Funny. I didn't hear you mention that to the couple over there," she said, nodding toward a young couple who had just been handed a set of keys to a luxury sedan without any hassle. Gary's face flushed slightly, but he recovered quickly. "They're long-time customers. We know them well," he said, his voice laced with feigned politeness. Angela let out a slow breath, feeling the anger simmering just beneath her skin. She didn't want to make a scene, but Gary's blatant disrespect was testing her patience. "Look," she said, her voice now sharp, "I'm a customer too. And I'd like to be treated as one." Gary gave her a long, appraising look before rolling his eyes. "Fine," he muttered, turning on his heel and walking toward the front desk. "I'll get the keys. But don't scratch it. Repairs on these are a bit out of the usual budget." Angela's jaw tightened, but she bit back a retort, following him to the front desk. She watched as he exchanged a look with one of his colleagues, both of them snickering under their breaths. She knew she was the topic of their mockery, but she forced herself to ignore it. She was here for the car, not for them. When Gary finally handed her the keys, his fingers lingered just a moment too long, and his eyes held a glint of challenge. "All right," he said, "the car's out front. Let's see if you can handle it." Angela took the keys without a word, refusing to let him see how much his attitude had rattled her. She walked to the convertible, her heart pounding with a mix of excitement and anger. She was going to prove him wrong. She was going to show him she was more than capable. As she slid into the driver's seat and adjusted the mirrors, she noticed Gary watching her from a distance, his arms crossed and his expression smug. She took a deep breath, placed her hands on the wheel, and started the engine. The car purred to life, a powerful, satisfying sound that made her smile. She shifted into gear and pulled out of the dealership lot, her determination flaring as she felt the car respond smoothly to her touch. The streets whizzed by as she took the car through its paces, testing its speed and handling. The wind blew through her hair, and she felt a thrill of freedom and power. For those few moments, she forgot all about Gary and his condescending attitude. This car was everything she had dreamed of, and she was going to make it hers. When she returned to the dealership, she stepped out of the car with a satisfied smile, ready to finalize the purchase. But as she approached the front desk, Gary was waiting for her, his expression sour. "So, did you enjoy the little joyride?" he sneered. Angela's smile faded. "I'll take it," she said, her voice firm. "Let's go ahead and start the paperwork." Gary's eyes widened slightly, clearly surprised. "Are you sure? I mean, it's not exactly an easy commitment." Angela fixed him with a hard stare. "I said I'll take it." Gary hesitated, his mouth opening and closing as if he were searching for a response. Finally, he nodded, though the scorn was still evident in his expression. "All right, then. Follow me to my office, and we'll get you started." Angela followed him, her shoulders tense. She wasn't about to let him get under her skin any further, but she knew this wasn't over. She could feel the eyes of the other salespeople on her, their whispers and judgment following her every step. But she kept her head high, determined to see this through. As she entered his office, Gary gestured for her to sit, his smirk returning. "So, are we going to be listing this in your name, or someone else's?" Angela's patience finally snapped. She leaned forward, her voice cold and sharp. "Why don't you just do your job, and stop making assumptions about me?" Gary's face hardened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he pulled out the paperwork, slapping it down in front of her with a dismissive air. But as Angela reached for a pen, a loud bang echoed through the dealership, followed by the shouts and screams of startled customers. Angela's heart pounded as she looked her hand hovering over the paper, as the chaos unfolded outside the office door, and a ripple of panic ran through the dealership. She glanced at Gary, who had gone pale, his smug expression replaced by wide-eyed shock. The sound of footsteps rushing by the office door made them both instinctively duck. "Stay here," Gary said, his voice shaky, as if he were trying to convince himself he still had control. He glanced out the narrow window in the door, his hands trembling. Angela could see that he was just as scared as she was, but she didn't trust him to make the situation any better. Ignoring him, she cautiously stepped toward the office window that overlooked the showroom. Outside, she could see people running for cover, crouching behind cars, or fleeing toward the nearest exits. A man dressed in dark clothing with a ski mask pulled down over his face had a gun in his hand. He was shouting commands, though Angela couldn't make out his words over the chaos. Angela felt a wave of fear but forced herself to remain calm. She knew panicking would only make things worse. She turned to Gary, who was still peeking through the office door, his hand clutching the handle like it was his lifeline. "We need to find a way out," she said, her voice steady. Gary glanced at her, and for the first time, the smug attitude was gone, replaced by genuine fear. "Are you crazy?" he hissed. "We can't go out there. He has a gun." Angela's jaw tightened, frustration simmering. "And sitting here makes us easy targets. We need to move. Now." He shook his head, still clutching the door handle as though it could shield him from the unfolding danger. Angela didn't have time for his cowardice. She stepped closer to the window, looking for an escape route. Her eyes locked on a side door near the far end of the showroom that led to the service garage. Just then, the gunman's voice rose, louder and angrier. Angela watched in horror as he grabbed a young salesman by the arm, dragging him to the center of the showroom. The young man was visibly terrified, his hands shaking as he pleaded with the gunman, but the masked man only shoved him harder. Angela's hands clenched into fists as she watched the scene. She knew they couldn't stay in the office. It would only be a matter of time before the gunman searched every room in the building. She turned back to Gary, her patience wearing thin. "We're leaving. Now." Gary opened his mouth to protest, but before he could speak, a sudden barrage of gunshots erupted. Both of them dropped to the floor, instinctively covering their heads as the sound of shattering glass and frantic screams filled the air. Angela's heart raced, but she forced herself to stay focused. "Get up," she whispered urgently, reaching for Gary's arm. "We're getting out of here before he decides to come in here next." Gary, pale and visibly shaken, nodded slowly. Angela led the way, keeping low as she moved toward the office door. She peeked out cautiously, seeing that the gunman's back was turned as he shouted at a group of customers huddled near the entrance. They slipped out of the office, moving quickly but quietly along the edge of the room. Angela kept her eyes fixed on the side door that led to the garage, praying they could make it there without being noticed. But as they crossed the showroom floor, Gary's foot caught on the edge of a display, sending a metal frame crashing to the ground. The loud noise echoed through the room, catching the gunman's attention. His head snapped around, his eyes locking onto them. Angela felt a surge of fear as he raised his gun in their direction. "Run," she yelled, grabbing Gary's arm and pulling him forward. They sprinted toward the garage door, the sound of gunshots echoing behind them. Angela felt a rush of adrenaline as she pushed open the heavy door, practically shoving Gary through before slamming it shut behind them. They stumbled into the service garage, gasping for breath. The mechanic's tools and equipment were scattered around, and the faint smell of oil and rubber filled the air. Angela quickly scanned the room, looking for an escape route. She spotted another door leading outside and pointed it out to Gary. "Come on," she said, her voice barely a whisper. They crept toward the exit, careful not to make any noise. But just as they reached the door, it swung open, revealing one of the gunman's accomplices standing in the doorway, blocking their path. Angela's mind raced. There was no way out. The accomplice, a bulky man with a menacing look in his eyes, raised his gun, his lips curving into a cruel smile. "Thought you could sneak out, huh?" he sneered. Angela felt a surge of defiance. She'd come this far, she wasn't about to give up now. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on a heavy wrench lying on the workbench nearby. Without a second thought, she lunged for it, grabbing the wrench and swinging it at the accomplice with all her strength. The metal made contact with a sickening crack, and the man staggered backward, clutching his head. Angela didn't waste a second. "Gary, run," she shouted, pushing past the dazed accomplice and sprinting toward the open door. Gary, finally snapping out of his stupor, followed her, his footsteps pounding against the concrete floor. They burst out into the alleyway behind the dealership, the bright afternoon sun momentarily blinding them. Angela could still hear the commotion inside, but she didn't stop. She knew they needed to get as far away from the building as possible. They ran down the alley, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Angela could hear sirens in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. She prayed that help was on the way and that they could put enough distance between themselves and the gunman. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the end of the alley, emerging onto a busy street filled with cars and pedestrians. Angela stumbled to a stop, bending over to catch her breath. Gary leaned against a nearby wall, his face pale and drenched in sweat. For a moment, neither of them spoke, both too shaken to find words. But as Angela looked at Gary, she saw a flicker of something other than fear in his eyes, maybe a glimmer of respect, or at the very least, an acknowledgement of what they'd just been through. The sirens grew louder, and moments later, a police car screeched to a halt at the curb. 2 officers jumped out, their hands on their weapons as they assessed the situation. Angela raised her hands, signaling that they weren't a threat. The officers approached, their expressions serious. "Are you two okay?" one of them asked, glancing between Angela and Gary. Angela nodded, though her legs were still trembling. "There's a gunman inside the dealership," she said, her voice steady despite the fear still coursing through her veins. "He's got hostages." The officers exchanged a glance, their faces grim. "We'll take care of it," one of them said, signaling for backup as they moved toward the building. Angela watched as more police cars arrived, their flashing lights illuminating the street. She felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion, knowing that they were finally safe. As Angela and Gary stood on the street, catching their breath, they watched police officers coordinate their efforts to secure the dealership. More sirens wailed in the distance as backup units arrived, and the area was quickly swarmed with law enforcement. The once bustling showroom was now a scene of intense urgency. Gary glanced sideways at Angela, looking as if he wanted to say something but didn't quite know how. After a moment, he finally managed, You really saved us back there." "That was," he trailed off, clearly uncomfortable giving her credit. Angela met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Just remember that next time you decide to judge someone by how they look," she said, her voice steady but carrying a hard edge. She was still angry, and the adrenaline coursing through her veins made it impossible to hide her feelings. Before Gary could respond, an officer approached them. "Ma'am, sir, we'll need to take your statements about what happened inside." "Are either of you injured?" he asked, glancing from one to the other with a look of professional concern. "We're fine," Angela replied, noticing Gary still seemed shaken. "But you need to get in there quickly. The gunman still got hostages, and he's not alone." The officer nodded, gesturing for them to follow him to a quieter spot on the sidewalk where they could give their statements. Angela recounted the events as clearly as possible, watching as more officers moved into the building, cautiously advancing information. She could see the tactical team preparing to enter, their rifles ready, faces grim as they braced themselves for the situation inside. Gary stammered through his own version of the story, his voice trembling as he described the gunman and his accomplice. He clutched his chest, visibly shaken, and Angela couldn't help but wonder if this experience had finally humbled him. Still, she didn't feel sorry for him. After everything he'd put her through, his fear was a fitting consequence. As they finished giving their statements, another officer approached, holding a radio. "We've secured the perimeter," he informed his colleague, nodding toward the building. "Looks like most of the hostages are safe, but we've got one suspect barricaded in the back with a few employees." Angela's heart sank at the news. She knew some of those employees. She had seen them earlier, laughing and chatting as they helped customers. The thought of them trapped inside with an armed criminal made her feel sick. She glanced at the officer, hoping for some reassurance that everything would be okay. The officer must have noticed her concern because he offered a small nod. "The team's well trained," he said. "They'll handle this. Just sit tight." Angela and Gary sat on the curb, watching the scene unfold in silence. Gary seemed to be at a loss, shifting uncomfortably as he occasionally glanced over at her. Angela could tell he wanted to say something, but after everything they had been through, she wasn't in the mood for small talk. She kept her gaze focused on the building, silently willing the officers to get everyone out safely. The minutes ticked by slowly, each one feeling like an eternity. Angela could feel her nerves beginning to fray, her body still tense from the ordeal. Just when she thought she couldn't take any more, a sudden burst of gunfire erupted from inside the dealership. The sound shattered the tense silence, and she felt her stomach twist with fear. Gary jumped, his eyes wide with panic. "Oh no, they're going to kill everyone in there," he explained, his voice barely a whisper. Angela clenched her fists, willing herself to stay calm. She glanced at the officer nearby, who was speaking into his radio with a look of intense focus. "They've got it under control," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "Just stay calm and wait. Our team knows what they're doing." As more officers moved into position around the building, Angela forced herself to breathe deeply, trying to push away the anxiety gnawing at her. She didn't want to think about the gunman inside, the innocent people caught in the middle, or the potential for things to go terribly wrong. Then, after a few minutes, a series of shouts echoed from within the building, followed by a loud crash. Angela strained to see what was happening, her heart pounding in her chest. Moments later, one of the dealership's glass doors was pushed open, and a group of employees hurried out, their faces pale and shaken but unharmed. She felt a wave of relief wash over her, grateful that at least some of the hostages had made it out safely. The tactical team soon emerged, escorting a handcuffed man who looked angry and defiant. It was the accomplice Angela had struck with the wrench, his face now bruised from their encounter. He glared at her as he was led away, but Angela held her head high, refusing to let him intimidate her. She was proud of what she'd done, proud that she hadn't backed down when things got tough. As she watched the police handle the situation, Angela felt a sense of calm return. She had survived an ordeal she would never forget, and though it had been terrifying, she knew she had acted bravely. The remaining officers continued their sweep of the dealership, but the immediate danger appeared to have passed. She felt a wave of gratitude that, at least for now, everyone was safe. A paramedic approached them, offering a quick examination in case they were injured. Angela assured him she was fine, but he insisted on checking for any signs of shock. Gary, still visibly shaken, was quieter than usual as he allowed the paramedic to tend to him. Angela stood nearby, watching him with a mix of emotions. She knew he had been afraid, and perhaps he had finally realized the importance of treating others with respect, regardless of their background. But as she stood there, she also felt a strange sense of closure. She didn't need Gary's apology, she had proven her strength to herself. Just then, a familiar face appeared from the crowd of officers. It was Detective Monroe, a family friend Angela hadn't seen in years. He approached her, his expression filled with relief. "Angela, I saw your name on the report and came over. Are you all right?" Angela smiled, grateful for the familiar face. "Yeah, I'm okay. It was intense. But I'm fine." Detective Monroe gave her a reassuring nod. "I'm glad to hear that. And I heard you handled yourself pretty well back there." Not everyone would have kept their cool. Angela shrugged, glancing at Gary, who was now deep in conversation with a paramedic. "Sometimes, you don't have a choice," she said quietly. As the chaos gradually subsided, the detective pulled her aside, away from the noise. "Listen, I'll make sure this gets handled properly. And I'll get you an update on your car purchase later. For now, maybe go home and get some rest. You've had a rough day." Angela nodded, feeling the exhaustion finally settle in. She glanced at Gary one last time, noting the stunned look on his face as he listened to the paramedic's reassurances. She felt a strange sense of satisfaction, knowing he had been forced to confront his own shortcomings. She hadn't set out to teach him a lesson, but she hoped he had learned something from this experience. Detective Monroe patted her shoulder gently. "Take care, Angela. And let me know if you need anything." As she turned to leave, Angela took one last look at the dealership, now surrounded by police cars and officers. The day had started with a simple car purchase, but had turned into something far more intense than she'd ever expected. Yet despite the chaos, Angela felt a renewed sense of confidence. She had faced adversity and come out stronger, proving to herself that she was capable of handling whatever life threw her way. Welcome to a story hub dedicated to exposing, understanding, and discussing stories. Here, we dive deep into real-life experiences. By sharing these stories, we hope to create awareness, inspire change, and encourage open dialogue. If you're passionate about building a fairer world, please join us, like, comment, and subscribe to support the community and keep up with new stories each day. The days that followed the ordeal at the dealership were a whirlwind for Angela. Though she tried to focus on getting back to her regular life, the events replayed in her mind like a movie she couldn't turn off. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the gunman's face, heard the shouts, and felt that rush of fear. But despite the lingering anxiety, she also felt a quiet sense of pride. She hadn't let fear paralyze her, hadn't allowed Gary's disrespect to break her spirit. In the meantime, she hadn't heard anything from the dealership about the car she had been trying to buy. She assumed the place would be closed for a while, given the investigation and damage that had occurred. But 3 days later, she received a call from Detective Monroe. "Angela," he said warmly, his voice a welcome comfort, "I wanted to update you on the situation at the dealership. Things have finally settled, and they'll be back in business soon." "That's good to hear," she replied, surprised at how relieved she felt. Despite the turmoil, she still needed a car, and she hadn't quite moved on from the vehicle she'd had her eye on that day. "Any word on the car I wanted?" Detective Monroe chuckled. "Actually, that's part of why I called. I spoke to the manager. They're offering a significant discount to you, in light of everything. They appreciate how you kept things under control that day." Angela couldn't help but smile. "Well, I'll have to go back, then," she said, though she felt a pang of hesitation. The idea of walking back into the dealership stirred up a host of emotions. Still, she wasn't one to back down from a challenge. The next morning, Angela made her way back to the dealership. She pulled up to the building, now repaired, with shiny new glass doors in place. She took a deep breath before stepping out of her old car and walking into the dealership, her heels clicking against the polished tile floor. As she walked in, she felt the weight of curious stares from the employees who recognized her. She kept her head high, ignoring their whispers as she approached the front desk. This time, a different salesman greeted her. He was polite, friendly even, and listened attentively as she explained the situation. Angela felt a small sense of relief. She hadn't been sure if Gary was still working there, but at least this man was respectful. As they discussed the details of the car, Angela's attention was drawn to a commotion at the far end of the showroom. To her surprise, Gary was there, his face flushed with irritation as he argued with a customer. The customer, a middle-aged man in a business suit, looked unimpressed by Gary's words and seemed to be on the verge of walking away. Angela observed the scene with quiet satisfaction. It appeared that Gary hadn't changed much since their last encounter. His arrogance and condescension were still intact, and he seemed oblivious to how his behavior drove customers away. "Excuse me," she said to the salesman who was assisting her. "I'd like to test drive the car again, just to make sure it's the right fit." "Of course, ma'am," he replied, nodding enthusiastically. "Let me get the keys for you." Angela took a seat near the showroom's main entrance as she waited. She could still hear Gary's voice rising in frustration with the customer he was trying, and failing, to impress. Eventually, the customer shook his head and walked away, clearly fed up with Gary's attitude. Gary watched him go, his face a mask of disbelief and anger. Before Angela could turn away, Gary spotted her. His eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, he looked as if he were going to ignore her. But then he seemed to change his mind and strode over, his expression guarded. "Angela," he said stiffly, barely concealing his disdain. "Back so soon?" Angela met his gaze calmly. "Yes, I am. Unlike you, I still need a car, and I thought I'd give the dealership another chance." Gary's jaw tightened, and for a split second, she could see the struggle behind his eyes. Part of him wanted to lash out, but he seemed to realize that he no longer held any power over her. He cleared his throat, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Of course. "We're always happy to have you as a customer," he replied, his voice dripping with forced politeness. Angela raised an eyebrow, amused by his sudden change in demeanor. "I appreciate the professionalism," she said, her tone even. "Though it would have been nice to see it the first time around." Before Gary could respond, the salesman returned with the keys, and Angela rose from her seat. "I'll be taking a test drive," she said, her eyes never leaving Gary's face. She wanted him to understand that she wasn't intimidated by him, that his attitude meant nothing to her. The test drive was smooth and exhilarating, the car handling perfectly as she maneuvered it through the streets. Angela felt a surge of excitement. This was the car she had wanted all along, and she knew it would be hers soon. When she returned to the dealership, she was ready to make her purchase. As she walked back into the showroom, however, she noticed something strange. Gary was talking quietly to the manager, his face pale and his hands gesturing wildly. The manager looked annoyed, his arms crossed as he listened to whatever excuse Gary was offering. Angela couldn't hear their conversation, but it was clear that Gary was trying to talk his way out of trouble. The manager's expression grew sterner as Gary continued to plead his case. Finally, the manager shook his head, his voice raised just enough for Angela to catch a few words. "Not how we treat customers, tarnishing the dealership's reputation. This can't continue, Gary." Angela hid a small smile, not wanting to draw attention to herself. She watched as Gary's face flushed with embarrassment and frustration. It was obvious that he was receiving a reprimand for his behavior, and she couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Maybe this was the wake-up call he needed. Just as she turned away, the manager called out to her. "Ms. Johnson, could I speak with you for a moment?" Angela nodded, approaching the two men. Gary looked down, clearly uncomfortable in her presence, and she could tell he was hoping to avoid further humiliation. "I just wanted to personally apologize for your previous experience here," the manager said, his tone sincere. "It was brought to my attention that you were treated disrespectfully, and I want you to know that this is not how we conduct business. Our goal is to make every customer feel valued." Angela glanced at Gary, who was fidgeting uncomfortably, his gaze fixed on the floor. She nodded at the manager, accepting his apology. "Thank you," she replied. "I appreciate it. I hope this means no other customers will have to go through the same treatment." The manager gave her a firm nod. "Absolutely. We've taken steps to ensure it won't happen again." With that, Angela finalized her purchase, feeling a sense of closure as she signed the papers. The experience had been difficult, but it had also taught her something important. She didn't need anyone's approval to know her own worth. She knew she had stood her ground and had walked away stronger. As she prepared to leave the dealership, Angela took one last look at Gary, who was still standing beside the manager, looking thoroughly defeated. She gave him a polite nod, her expression calm and untroubled. "Good luck, Gary," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "I hope you find what you're looking for." Without waiting for a response, Angela turned and walked out of the dealership, the keys to her new car in hand. She felt a surge of pride and excitement as she looked at the sleek vehicle parked outside, knowing it represented not just a new mode of transportation but a testament to her resilience. Angela left the dealership that day with a mix of emotions. She was glad to have gotten her car and felt triumphant about standing up to Gary, but the experience had left a lasting impression on her. She knew it wasn't the first time someone like Gary had acted out of prejudice, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. Yet, she was determined to focus on the positive. She had come out of the situation stronger and wiser, knowing that she had proven her worth, not only to others but to herself. As Angela drove her new car down the city streets, she took in the view. The car was everything she had wanted, sleek, comfortable, and powerful. It felt like a well-deserved reward after all she had been through. She decided to take the scenic route back to her neighborhood, savoring the smooth drive and the sense of freedom the car gave her. That evening, as she parked her car in the driveway, she couldn't shake the feeling that the day had left her with unfinished business. Her experience with Gary had stirred up memories and emotions she hadn't thought about in a long time. She thought of all the times she had been doubted, overlooked, or mistreated simply because of her appearance, and how she had always managed to rise above it. In a way, this incident had served as a reminder of her resilience. Over the next few days, Angela's life returned to a more familiar rhythm. She continued her work, enjoyed time with friends and family, and started making plans for a short getaway, a well-earned break. The new car was a joy to drive, and each time she got behind the wheel, she felt a renewed sense of accomplishment. But one evening, about a week after her visit to the dealership, Angela received a call from an unknown number. She hesitated, unsure whether to answer, but curiosity got the better of her. "Hello? Angela? This is Detective Monroe," a familiar voice said on the other end. Angela's interest peaked. "Detective Monroe, hi. Is everything all right?" "There's something I thought you'd want to know," he said, his tone serious. "It's about the dealership. There's been another incident. And, well, it involves Gary." Angela frowned, surprised by the news. "What happened?" Detective Monroe took a moment before responding. Apparently, Gary had another run-in with a customer. This time, things got out of hand. He's been dismissed from the dealership, and there's an ongoing investigation. It sounds like he made some very inappropriate comments and crossed the line with another customer. Angela felt a mix of emotions at the news. She wasn't entirely surprised, but it was still disheartening to hear. Gary's behavior hadn't changed after their encounter, and now it seemed he was facing the consequences of his actions. "Thank you for letting me know," Angela said, processing the information. "I guess some people just don't learn." "Unfortunately, that seems to be the case," Detective Monroe replied. "But I thought you'd appreciate the update. On a brighter note, I'm glad to hear you're enjoying your new car. You deserve it." Angela smiled. "Thank you, Detective Monroe. I do love it. And I appreciate you keeping me in the loop." After she hung up, Angela sat for a while, reflecting on the news. She had hoped that her encounter with Gary might have given him a chance to change, to rethink his behavior, but it was clear he had chosen a different path. In a strange way, she felt a sense of closure. She knew now that she had done her part, and whatever happened to Gary from here on out was no longer her concern. The following weekend, Angela decided to take her new car for a much-needed road trip. She invited her best friend, Tasha, who had been eager to see the new ride and was thrilled at the idea of a getaway. The two women packed their bags, loaded up the car, and set off early on Saturday morning, excited for a few days of relaxation and adventure. As they drove through the scenic countryside, Angela and Tasha chatted and laughed, the tension of the past week melting away. They stopped at a cozy bed and breakfast, enjoying the fresh air and the beautiful surroundings. The trip was everything Angela had hoped for, a chance to recharge and leave her troubles behind. One evening, as they sat on the porch of the bed and breakfast, watching the sun set over the hills, Tasha turned to Angela with a thoughtful expression. "You know," Tasha began, "I still can't believe what happened at that dealership. It's unbelievable how some people still act like that in this day and age." Angela nodded, taking a sip of her tea. "I know. It shocked me too. But honestly, I feel stronger because of it. I didn't let it get to me, and I didn't let him define my worth." Tasha smiled, her eyes filled with admiration. "You handled it like a champ. A lot of people would have lost their cool, but you kept it together and showed him who's boss." Angela chuckled, feeling a warm sense of pride. "It's funny, you go through life thinking you've seen it all, but then something like that happens, and you realize there's always more to learn. I think it just made me more determined to stand up for myself." As they continued talking, Angela felt a sense of peace wash over her. She was grateful for the support of friends like Tasha, who reminded her of her strength and resilience. The road trip had been exactly what she needed, a chance to move forward, leaving the dealership incident behind and focusing on the future. After their return, Angela settled back into her routine, feeling more grounded and confident than ever. The dealership incident faded into a distant memory, but it left her with a renewed sense of purpose. She knew she had a responsibility to stand up not only for herself but for others who might face similar challenges. One afternoon, while running errands, she ran into Detective Monroe at a local coffee shop. He greeted her warmly, and they caught up for a few minutes. "You know, Angela," he said, "I'm working with a community organization that's focused on promoting equality and addressing discrimination in the workplace. Given everything you went through, I think you'd be a great voice to speak at one of our events." Angela was taken aback but intrigued by the idea. "I'd love to help in any way I can," she replied, feeling a spark of excitement. She had always wanted to make a difference, to use her experiences to inspire others, and this seemed like a perfect opportunity. Over the next few weeks, Angela became involved with the organization, attending meetings and sharing her insights with others who had faced similar situations. She found a new sense of purpose in helping others find their voices and stand up against discrimination. Her story resonated with many, and she felt a deep sense of fulfillment knowing she was making a difference. And as for Gary, Angela rarely thought of him anymore. She knew he had faced consequences for his actions, and she hoped he would learn and grow from the experience. But regardless of his choices, she knew she had moved on, stronger and more determined than ever. Each day, as she drove her new car, Angela felt a sense of freedom and empowerment. She had overcome the challenges thrown her way, and she was ready for whatever the future held. Angela's involvement with the community organization deepened over the next few months. She found herself not only attending events but also organizing workshops and speaking at gatherings. Her story of resilience resonated with people from all walks of life, and each time she shared it, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The organization even invited her to help lead a new initiative focused on empowering individuals facing discrimination in the workplace, a role she embraced wholeheartedly. Through her work, Angela met countless people who had their own stories of discrimination and resilience. Listening to their experiences, she realized that the issues she had faced weren't unique, they were part of a larger societal problem. Many people had dealt with the same indignities, the same struggles, and they all shared the same desire for respect and dignity. One evening, after a particularly moving workshop, Angela returned home feeling both fulfilled and contemplative. She reflected on how much her life had changed since that day at the dealership. That moment of frustration and humiliation had ultimately led her to a place where she could make a real difference. She had taken what was meant to hurt her and turned it into something that empowered not only herself but others as well. A few days later, Angela was surprised to receive a phone call from a journalist who had heard about her work with the organization. The journalist wanted to feature her in an article about community leaders who were making a positive impact in their cities. "It's an honor," Angela replied, both humbled and excited by the opportunity. "But I'd really like the focus to be on the people we're helping and the stories they have to share. My role is just a small part of the bigger picture." The journalist agreed, and soon after, the article was published. Angela's story was met with an outpouring of support, with many people reaching out to thank her for her bravery and resilience. Among the messages she received, one stood out. It was from a former employee at the dealership. "Hi Angela," the message read. "I worked at the dealership where you had that awful experience. I saw how Gary treated you, and I wanted to reach out and apologize. I should have spoken up that day, but I was afraid of losing my job. I just want you to know that your story has inspired me to stand up for what's right, even if it's difficult. Thank you for being a voice for people like me." Angela was touched by the message, realizing that her actions had a ripple effect, influencing even those who had once stood by in silence. She took a deep breath, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. She responded with a kind note, encouraging the person to continue standing up for themselves and others. But just as Angela was settling into her new role as a community advocate, she received news that stirred up old emotions. She learned that Gary, the salesman from the dealership, was once again in trouble. This time, it wasn't just a matter of workplace complaints. According to a friend in law enforcement, Gary had been involved in a heated altercation with another customer that had escalated to the point of police intervention. Though Angela had tried to move on from her experience with Gary, the news brought back memories of that day at the dealership. She couldn't help but wonder if he would ever learn from his actions, or if he was destined to repeat the same mistakes indefinitely. Then, one evening, as Angela was preparing for an upcoming event, she received a call from Detective Monroe. She hadn't heard from him in a while, and his voice sounded serious. "Angela, I know it's been a while, but I thought you'd want to know that Gary has reached out to our department. He's requested mediation through the organization you work with." Angela was stunned. Mediation? For what? Apparently, he's been mandated to attend a series of community-led mediation sessions as part of a restorative justice program. He chose your organization, hoping to speak with someone he's wronged in the past. He specifically mentioned you. Angela's mind raced. The idea of sitting down with Gary was both daunting and unexpected. Part of her felt that she had already moved past the incident, yet another part of her was curious. Maybe this was an opportunity to find closure, not just for herself, but possibly even for Gary. After a long conversation with the organization's leadership team, Angela decided to accept the mediation request. They arranged to meet in a neutral setting, a community center where the organization often held workshops and discussions. The room was quiet and welcoming, with chairs set up in a circle and calming artwork on the walls. Angela arrived early, her heart beating faster than she'd expected. When Gary entered the room, she almost didn't recognize him. He looked different, tired, worn down, and far from the arrogant man she remembered. As he sat across from her, he avoided eye contact, fidgeting with his hands. Angela watched him carefully, feeling a mix of emotions. The mediator, a kind and experienced woman named Clara, began the session by setting ground rules and inviting each of them to share their experiences. After a few moments of silence, Gary spoke up. "Angela, I know I messed up. I've been thinking about that day ever since, and I'm ashamed of how I treated you. I've lost my job, and I've been dealing with a lot of fallout because of my behavior. I guess I just wanted to say I'm sorry." Angela listened, her expression calm and composed. She had come a long way since that day, and while hearing his apology was validating, it didn't erase the hurt she had felt. "Thank you, Gary," she replied evenly. "I appreciate your apology, but I have to be honest, I was hurt by how you treated me. It wasn't just disrespectful, it was degrading. And it wasn't only about me. I know others experienced the same treatment, but they were afraid to speak up." Gary looked down, his face flushed with regret. "I know," he said quietly. "I was caught up in my own ego, thinking I was better than everyone else. I see now that I hurt a lot of people. I lost everything because of it. I'm trying to rebuild my life, but I know I have a long way to go." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Angela took a deep breath, feeling a sense of relief. This was a side of Gary she had never seen before, a side that was vulnerable and remorseful. She realized that, while she couldn't change the past, she had the power to choose how she responded in the present. "I'm glad to hear that you're willing to change, Gary," she said, her voice steady. "But remember, it's not just about saying you're sorry. It's about doing better, treating people with respect, and recognizing their worth. I hope that you're sincere, not just with me, but with everyone you meet from here on out." Gary nodded, his expression sincere. "I understand. Thank you for giving me a chance to apologize. I know I can't erase what I did, but I'll do my best to make things right." The session ended with a sense of closure. Angela left feeling lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She hadn't known what to expect from the mediation, but she was grateful for the opportunity to face the past and find a sense of peace. As she drove home that evening, Angela thought about the journey she had been on. The experience at the dealership had been painful, but it had also led her to discover a strength within herself that she hadn't known existed. She had become a voice for others, an advocate for respect and equality. And now, she had even found a measure of understanding with the person who had once hurt her. Angela's involvement with the community organization deepened over the next few months. She found herself not only attending events but also organizing workshops and speaking at gatherings. Her story of resilience resonated with people from all walks of life, and each time she shared it, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The organization even invited her to help lead a new initiative focused on empowering individuals facing discrimination in the workplace, a role she embraced wholeheartedly. Through her work, Angela met countless people who had their own stories of discrimination and resilience. Listening to their experiences, she realized that the issues she had faced weren't unique, they were part of a larger societal problem. Many people had dealt with the same indignities, the same struggles, and they all shared the same desire for respect and dignity. One evening, after a particularly moving workshop, Angela returned home feeling both fulfilled and contemplative. She reflected on how much her life had changed since that day at the dealership. That moment of frustration and humiliation had ultimately led her to a place where she could make a real difference. She had taken what was meant to hurt her and turned it into something that empowered not only herself but others as well. A few days later, Angela was surprised to receive a phone call from a journalist who had heard about her work with the organization. The journalist wanted to feature her in an article about community leaders who were making a positive impact in their cities. "It's an honor," Angela replied, both humbled and excited by the opportunity. "But I'd really like the focus to be on the people we're helping and the stories they have to share. My role is just a small part of the bigger picture." The journalist agreed, and soon after, the article was published. Angela's story was met with an outpouring of support, with many people reaching out to thank her for her bravery and resilience. Among the messages she received, one stood out. It was from a former employee at the dealership. "Hi Angela," the message read. "I worked at the dealership where you had that awful experience. I saw how Gary treated you, and I wanted to reach out and apologize. I should have spoken up that day, but I was afraid of losing my job. I just want you to know that your story has inspired me to stand up for what's right, even if it's difficult. Thank you for being a voice for people like me." Angela was touched by the message, realizing that her actions had a ripple effect, influencing even those who had once stood by in silence. She took a deep breath, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. She responded with a kind note, encouraging the person to continue standing up for themselves and others. But just as Angela was settling into her new role as a community advocate, she received news that stirred up old emotions. She learned that Gary, the salesman from the dealership, was once again in trouble. This time, it wasn't just a matter of workplace complaints. According to a friend in law enforcement, Gary had been involved in a heated altercation with another customer that had escalated to the point of police intervention. Though Angela had tried to move on from her experience with Gary, the news brought back memories of that day at the dealership. She couldn't help but wonder if he would ever learn from his actions, or if he was destined to repeat the same mistakes indefinitely. Then, one evening, as Angela was preparing for an upcoming event, she received a call from Detective Monroe. She hadn't heard from him in a while, and his voice sounded serious. "Angela, I know it's been a while, but I thought you'd want to know that Gary has reached out to our department. He's requested mediation through the organization you work with." Angela was stunned. Mediation? For what? Apparently, he's been mandated to attend a series of community-led mediation sessions as part of a restorative justice program. He chose your organization, hoping to speak with someone he's wronged in the past. He specifically mentioned you. Angela's mind raced. The idea of sitting down with Gary was both daunting and unexpected. Part of her felt that she had already moved past the incident, yet another part of her was curious. Maybe this was an opportunity to find closure, not just for herself, but possibly even for Gary. After a long conversation with the organization's leadership team, Angela decided to accept the mediation request. They arranged to meet in a neutral setting, a community center where the organization often held workshops and discussions. The room was quiet and welcoming, with chairs set up in a circle and calming artwork on the walls. Angela arrived early, her heart beating faster than she'd expected. When Gary entered the room, she almost didn't recognize him. He looked different, tired, worn down, and far from the arrogant man she remembered. As he sat across from her, he avoided eye contact, fidgeting with his hands. Angela watched him carefully, feeling a mix of emotions. The mediator, a kind and experienced woman named Clara, began the session by setting ground rules and inviting each of them to share their experiences. After a few moments of silence, Gary spoke up. "Angela, I know I messed up. I've been thinking about that day ever since, and I'm ashamed of how I treated you. I've lost my job, and I've been dealing with a lot of fallout because of my behavior. I guess I just wanted to say I'm sorry." Angela listened, her expression calm and composed. She had come a long way since that day, and while hearing his apology was validating, it didn't erase the hurt she had felt. "Thank you, Gary," she replied evenly. "I appreciate your apology, but I have to be honest, I was hurt by how you treated me. It wasn't just disrespectful, it was degrading. And it wasn't only about me. I know others experienced the same treatment, but they were afraid to speak up." Gary looked down, his face flushed with regret. "I know," he said quietly. "I was caught up in my own ego, thinking I was better than everyone else. I see now that I hurt a lot of people. I lost everything because of it. I'm trying to rebuild my life, but I know I have a long way to go." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Angela took a deep breath, feeling a sense of relief. This was a side of Gary she had never seen before, a side that was vulnerable and remorseful. She realized that, while she couldn't change the past, she had the power to choose how she responded in the present. "I'm glad to hear that you're willing to change, Gary," she said, her voice steady. "But remember, it's not just about saying you're sorry. It's about doing better, treating people with respect, and recognizing their worth. I hope that you're sincere, not just with me, but with everyone you meet from here on out." Gary nodded, his expression sincere. "I understand. Thank you for giving me a chance to apologize. I know I can't erase what I did, but I'll do my best to make things right." The session ended with a sense of closure. Angela left feeling lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She hadn't known what to expect from the mediation, but she was grateful for the opportunity to face the past and find a sense of peace. As she drove home that evening, Angela thought about the journey she had been on. The experience at the dealership had been painful, but it had also led her to discover a strength within herself that she hadn't known existed. She had become a voice for others, an advocate for respect and equality. And now, she had even found a measure of understanding with the person who had once hurt her. The weeks that followed Angela's mediation session with Gary were filled with reflection. She realized that confronting the past and finding closure with him had been the final step in a journey that began the moment she walked into that dealership. She had moved from feeling humiliated and disrespected to discovering her own strength, and now, she felt a sense of peace that had eluded her before. But life had one more twist in store for her. One day, while preparing for an upcoming speaking event on workplace discrimination, Angela received a call from the community center director, Clara, who had mediated her session with Gary. "Angela," Clara's voice sounded unusually urgent. "We have a situation here. A few community members who've attended our workshops and advocacy events have reported threats. They're receiving anonymous calls, letters, all laced with hate speech and intimidation. We believe it may be a reaction to our recent push for workplace equality. Angela felt a chill run down her spine. Do we have any idea who's behind it? We're not certain, but the timing suggests it could be someone connected to those who felt the fallout from recent efforts to expose discriminatory practices, Clara explained, her tone tense. We're beefing up security for the event and notifying participants. I just thought you should know in case you see anything unusual. Angela's heart pounded. She had faced her own ordeal with discrimination, but threats to others in her community were on a different level. After ending the call, she sat in silence, processing this unsettling turn. Despite everything, she knew she would not back down. The evening of the event arrived, and the room was filled with people eager to hear Angela's story and share their own experiences. The energy in the room was one of both anticipation and solidarity. But there was an underlying tension. Extra security was present, and Clara had made sure everyone knew to stay alert. As Angela stepped onto the stage to begin her speech, she felt a sense of purpose settle over her. She was here not only to share her journey but to empower others to stand up for themselves. She began speaking, recounting her story with sincerity, from the painful experience at the dealership to her transformation into an advocate. She spoke of resilience, unity, and the importance of challenging prejudice. About halfway through her speech, Angela noticed a commotion near the back of the room. A man in a dark jacket, face partially hidden by a cap, was glaring at her. She felt his hostility from across the room. But she pressed on, determined to finish. Moments later, a sharp noise cut through the room. The man in the jacket was shouting, his words echoing with hate. You think you can change anything? People like you don't belong here. The security team moved quickly, escorting him out before he could cause further disruption. Angela stood in silence for a moment, feeling a rush of both anger and courage. She glanced at the audience, who watched her with wide eyes, waiting to see how she would respond. She took a deep breath, then spoke into the microphone. Moments like this remind me of why we're here, she said, her voice steady and filled with resolve. There are people who don't want change, who are threatened by equality and respect. But we're here because we refuse to let hate win. We stand together, stronger than any voice that tries to silence us. The crowd erupted in applause, some people standing, their faces reflecting admiration and encouragement. Angela continued her speech with renewed determination, speaking from her heart. By the time she finished, the room was filled with a powerful sense of unity and resilience. People lined up to thank her, to tell her how much her story had inspired them. In the days that followed, the incident at the event only strengthened the community's resolve. More people reached out to the organization, eager to get involved, to support one another, and to push for change. Angela's story was shared widely, and she received countless messages of support from people who had felt alone in their struggles with discrimination. A few weeks later, Angela was invited to a meeting with a local task force focused on addressing workplace discrimination and harassment. They wanted her to help shape new policies and initiatives to create safer and more inclusive environments. She accepted without hesitation, knowing that this was yet another step in her journey. One day, as Angela was preparing for a task force meeting, she received an unexpected message from Gary. It was a simple note, but its words resonated deeply with her. Thank you for giving me a chance. I've started volunteering at the community center and working to become a better person. I'll always be grateful for your strength and kindness. Angela read the message twice, feeling a sense of closure she hadn't anticipated. She realized that, in her own journey to heal and grow, she had also given others the opportunity to change. Her decision to forgive hadn't just freed her, it had allowed Gary, and perhaps others, to confront their own prejudices. From that day forward, Angela continued her work with a renewed sense of hope and purpose. She knew the fight for equality and respect would never be easy, but she also knew that her efforts, and the efforts of those who stood beside her, could bring real change. As she drove her car through the city streets, she thought back to that day at the dealership, the day that had felt like the beginning of a nightmare but had instead sparked the start of her most powerful journey. What had once been a painful memory had now transformed into a source of strength. Angela's story became a beacon for those facing similar struggles. Her courage inspired many, and her voice was a constant reminder that, despite the hate and obstacles, progress was possible. And as she moved forward, Angela knew she would continue to stand up, speak out, and uplift others, ensuring that no one else would have to feel alone in their fight for respect and dignity.